Hello everyone, Leafreed here. Today I was just reflecting and thinking about how I'm crossing over between the boundaries of literature and video games and my passions. I thought I would talk about my favorite game of all time, which is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And it's interesting that Ocarina finds itself in the top 10s or, best game of all time for quite a few people. And for some people, they can't comprehend it or say it's been outdated, that the newer Zeldas or other titles have essentially outstripped it of that title. And it still, to me, is my favorite game of all time, and it's really because of the narrative and the story and the way that it's essentially presented and distilled. It was just funny, there was a study done that essentially broke down the different types of gamers and the reward centers for certain gamers, and it divided it between narrative, competitiveness, and strategy, essentially. So, while if you're a PC gamer, your favorite game of all time is probably Half-Life, because Half-Life 2, because when it came out, the physics engine, the design of, the graphics, everything from a technology standpoint was really, really advanced for Half-Life 2. And you look at the year it came out, 2004, like it was a decade ahead in terms of technology, and a lot of other, systems and other things at the same time could not compete at all. And a lot of things that Half-Life 2 became very standardized, like, physics puzzles, and even its story was actually not bad. But a lot of people look at Half-Life 2 today and say, well, its story isn't really that great. It's just kind of like whatever. It's not bad, mind you, but it's okay. And technology progresses, technology goes on, and now eventually everything is kind of at a Half-Life level of quality. Of course, the problem is that even though technology evolves, stories stay the same, and a good story essentially stands the test of time. That's why you have things like the Iliad, the Divine Comedy, the Bible, even as a piece of literature. All of these stories essentially extend beyond what the paper that they're written on, the cover of the book. They are ideas, and the mental space transcends the physical. And that's why now today, if people had to choose between their favorite game, they might choose their favorite story, their favorite aesthetic, rather than what is technologically superior. So when we look at Ocarina, what is it about the story of Ocarina that stands the test of time and makes it a classic, one of the best games ever, in a lot of people's opinions? And I think for me, it follows the hero's journey just so categorically well. And when you do something that is kind of tropey, like a zombie game, like something like Left 4 Dead, another Valve example, it's really hard to stand out from your peers unless you do it quintessentially well, unless you do it at the core base archetype and idea of that thing to its best ability. And in Ocarina's case, I think that's what it accomplished. It just was another, kind of go at this kind of story, and it just came together in the right way. There's a few things about Ocarina that I just looking at videos recently and thinking about it recently that really stand out to me. One of those things is that as a kid, Ocarina was a very hard game, and I think I did have a strategy guide, but it was still very not exactly foolproof. But what was striking is that I can remember almost every single plot point, not just the story, but the plot point of each part of Ocarina, how to beat this area, get to this, what you need to do to get into Dodongo's cavern, what you need to do to get into Jabu Jabu's belly, what happens when you need to get the hook shot from the graveyard. For some reason, it's just inextricably vivid in my mind. The other thing that also stands out to me in Ocarina is the audio, specifically the ambience. And it's interesting because the sounds just sound very, very sharp, very crisp, and very detailed. And it makes sense because this was at a time when graphics were not able to give you an accurate depiction of exactly what you were getting. And so the audio component really made up for that. And there's some theory in cinematography where if you have a good picture but your audio is bad, no one's going to watch it. But if you have a bad picture but at least your audio is good, it's still very consumable. And that's very true about like old YouTube shorts I would watch from certain creators wherein the bit rate is like 240 or 480p sometimes, but the audio is crisp, and that allows it essentially to stand out. So Ocarina and the Hero's Journey, as Joseph Campbell, who tirelessly went over every single myth and foundation story between every culture, from the Aboriginal Australians to the Brothers Grimm to Native American, North America, South America, and Africa. He kind of compiled all of these myths and made, this template by which you can kind of create the perfect journey. And so if I can just recall it from memory, it's more or less, you have, the beginning where you have normalcy, and then you have something that disrupts that. You have the call to action. And outside of the call to action, you then have the guide, you then have the threshold, you then have the guardians, and then you're thrust into the adventure. And the adventure is composed of the trials and tribulations. And for video games, the trials and tribulations take up, most of the journey, because that's what it is. You kind of, and it's very similar because in a gameplay loop, for example, and for those who don't know, a gameplay loop is kind of like the basic elements of a game coming together, and then you just kind of rinse and repeat that. So for Devil May Cry, for example, you have a level, and you have an intro, you have enemies, you have like a mid-boss, you then have like a special weapon, you then have a final boss. And in Zelda's case, it's the same thing, but you would like have a character, an area, a dungeon, a mini-boss, a weapon to defeat the boss, the boss, and then another piece of the story is revealed and you continue on. And so after the trials and tribulations, you come to the revelation point. And at the revelation point, there's some big truth that's revealed, the big twist, and then everything changes. And then at that point, the hero, then or maybe a little bit later, is defeated, and then they have to like kind of pick themselves up and have like a comeback, essentially, and then a big montage, and then you kind of get ready for the final boss. And then after you defeat the big bad and kind of restore the truth and fix what was broken, you come to the final point where you essentially bring the boon back to society, where you do something that revolutionizes the world, where essentially you now have the thing that you can give back that will basically make everything that you went through worthwhile. And so that kind of loop and structure mirrors Zelda very much. So if we apply that to Ocarina, Link grows up in this little Kokiri village, and within that area, you could argue that that Mido might be the first guardian, but really I think it's Queen Goma, because in that context, this is kind of like the beginning of the adventure, and I kind of jumped ahead, but the call to action is basically, you've lived in this forest, you don't have your fairy, and so you feel like an outsider, you feel left out, and you feel like there's a reason for why you're distinct and special. And finally, a fairy comes to you, Navi, who is essentially your guide for the game, so that's the guardian coming in. And then finally you have to cross the threshold, which is the Deku Tree's mouth, because it's actually really funny. I really enjoy what they do in the game. I'm not sure if you know this, but the Deku Tree will say, After you've done the whole tutorial level, and by the way, the opening level in Kokiri Forest is really, really smart because it essentially acts as a giant tutorial area for you to figure out how to jump, how to platform, how to attack things, how to do Z targeting, which was totally new at the time. Targeting 3D was totally new. And so once you have your sword and shield and you go past Mido, you go to the Deku Tree and it says, do you have enough courage to actually enter in and face the danger? And if you say no, the Deku Tree will keep his mouth closed and the game will end. Like, the game won't end, you won't get a game over screen, but it'll just stay like that. So you have to delete your save file and start over. And I think it's really funny because it gives you, the player, the ability to reject the call of action, to not cross the threshold, and to just have the adventure end there. It's very similar to the Matrix red pill, blue pill scenario, which is really funny to see that in Zelda, of all things. And so, of course, most people say yes, and they go across the threshold. Queen Goma being, the main guardian, and then once you go through the dungeon, you kind of figure out, okay, it's going to be this, but it's just done over and over and over again throughout the whole game with a slight variation. And that's kind of what all games are. But games that do that really well, you don't actually realize you're doing the same thing, more or less mixed up over and over again. And so after that, you kind of have almost another call to action. When Zelda asks you to get the 3 spiritual stones, there's a higher purpose now, that you have to save Hyrule from this evil guy called Ganondorf. And then you have essentially more trials and tribulations, and then you have the revelation point where you have the fact that Ganondorf tricked you, and he essentially swaps the whole world around. And what occurs is that he essentially tricks you to get into the Sacred Realm so he can get the Triforce. And through that process, that's kind of the revelation point, the turning point, and you become an adult, essentially. But yeah, from that point, the world has been destroyed, and now you need to essentially reconquer it. So you've descended into this dark world, essentially. Very similar, by the way, to Link to the Past, where you go to the dark world, which is this other universe, but here the dark world is just 7 years in the future. And you see when total malevolence gets total control and power over the entire world, and it's a very short amount of time, everything can be destroyed and degraded. And you're kind of all alone now, and you kind of have to go out into the world, find your old connections, save them, and also save the land. And there's just so many elements in Zelda that I just love, more so in Ocarina than any other Zelda. One of those elements is the fact that most, if not all, of the characters you meet as a child, you see later, after this 7-year gap. And so it not only builds this continuity, but you get to see character development, like what happened to this person, how did they change, what became of them, did they perish? And I think it's something that makes me feel that Zelda, I should say Ocarina, out of all the Zeldas, is the closest thing to a dark fantasy. And I say that because, there's a lot of stories in Ocarina that just end in tragedy. I think maybe people might bring up Majora's Mask as the more tragic one. I think that one is more alternative and interesting. But in Ocarina, I think it's just a very strict kind of epic tragedy, where essentially this world has been destroyed and you need to restore it. And so your characters that you met as a child are now adults, so not only do you see what's become of them and how they've had their downfall, how they need saving, the town is completely destroyed. And so what I love about this is that you as Link are able to go out into the world, not only save the people that you used to know, but also save nature and the world. And every time you beat one of the dungeons in the future world, it heals the environment somehow. So in Lake Hylia, or in the Water Temple, it restores Lake Hylia. The Fire Temple, it restores Death Mountain and gets rid of the Red Ring of Death. The Forest Temple, I don't actually remember where that does anything, actually. The Shadow Temple, I think it stops the rainstorms, and plus, the Bongo Bongo and the Shadow demons were haunting that village anyway. And the Shadow Temple, I don't think that does anything either. The Spirit Temple, rather. Anyway, just maybe disregard what I said, but I love this theme of being able to heal nature and save the people that you once knew, that you already have kind of an emotional investment into as characters. The other thing I love about Zelda is that indirectly the way that this is accomplished is through the power of music. And I've always maintained or stipulated that music is one of the most important core aspects of a game, because it completely can shift the tone of what you're doing. If you've ever played a game without the BGM, it is a very different experience. And some games benefit from that kind of thing, like Dark Souls, where the less music you have, the more intense the atmosphere and in-depth you can get into the experience until you come to a boss battle and it's just all crazy music. But Zelda, not only is the music good, it's serviceable, it's catchy, it has really good melodies, very distinct melodies, and those kind of all go back to Koji Kondo, who a lot of these early Japanese composers were working on these 8-bit, 16-bit systems where you only have a limited amount of notes and space to actually make music. And so in order to make things that were memorable, that you wouldn't want to shoot yourself in the head after listening to it for like 12 hours, you had to make a really catchy, memorable melody. And so a lot of the melodies in Ocarina are very a lot of them are grandfathered in from the previous games, but not as many as I thought. I recently played Link to the Past, and they didn't have Kokiri Forest, they didn't have Goron's City, they didn't have Zora's Domain. A lot of that stuff was actually made just for Ocarina. And honestly, I talked about this in my other video, but the jump between Link to the Past and Ocarina is way bigger than I thought. Zoras in Link to the Past were hostile enemies only. There's one guy you can talk to that you can sell you his fins or something, his swimming flippers. But Gorons didn't exist. Kokiri didn't really exist. There was this one forest kid. The jump to Ocarina, so much lore was added that I just assumed was just a staple that was always there, and that's not the case. Like, a lot of the stuff for Ocarina was not grandfathered in. It was pretty much all original, which I find very, very surprising. But I digress. I think having good music is important in any game. One of my favorite games of all time is also Nier. And so the music, the OST in that game is phenomenal. But something that Zelda has that Nier doesn't is actually music as a function. And this branches off into what I feel is such an intrinsic aspect to making a good game. If I could make a game, I would definitely incorporate this, and this is what it is, that you have functional music. So in Ocarina of Time, it's called that because you have an Ocarina of Time, and you use that ocarina to essentially perform certain tasks. And what I love about it, you have multiple songs that you play. I love the fact that you can play absolute nonsense on it. I love you can hold the Z button and downshift and the pitch and everything, and I didn't realize that until way later after I finished the game as a kid. I don't know if I discovered it, but in any case, the ability to play music in the world and then create this energy which heals it is really interesting. And so you have kind of the main songs where they allow you to teleport to, the Fire Temple, the Forest Temple, etc. You have other songs that help you, change the weather, change night to day, summon Epona. And then the main one is Zelda's Lullaby, which is the main kind of theme of the game. And what I find so interesting is that this main theme literally heals the world. It's this, Zelda's energy and her expression through music is the catalyst by which the world actually heals. So if you play it, at certain areas that, the Royal Crest or whatever, it'll open up passageways and stuff. But there's also really cool things that even now I'm watching like YouTube shorts, like probably more than 20 years after this game came out, and it's just stuff I didn't know. Like if you play Zelda's Lullaby in this one place where like Navi will randomly, go green and hover around this area, it'll summon like a bunch of fairies or something, or it'll summon a purple rupee or something. And so and what I love about this, none of this is telegraphed. You just have to know, and you just play the music on your own intuition, and that's something that I really appreciate from Zelda games and Nintendo games in general. I think even up to Tears of the Kingdom, what I really loved about it, and the whole sort of melding fusion mechanic thing, is that it encourages the player to experiment and reach out and find like weird combinations, but it doesn't tell you any of this. It kind of tells you. It gives you the basics, but then you have a toolbox, and the way you use your tools on the world, you don't know. There's not like a little comm log where it's like, oh, Link, you have to play Zelda song and that'll summon a fairy. And that whole process of player experimentation and reward is something that is so unique to the gaming landscape, because no one told you to do that. That you, the player, are more empowered by your own intuition and ingenuity by figuring out how to overcome that obstacle. And I think that's something that we've really lost with what I would call the cinematographisation of video games. That is all kind of handheld and just a movie essentially, which is just rubbish. I don't know, just one real quick aside. This is my little revenge statement to the kids in school who used to say Deku and would correct me. I knew it was Deku. I don't know how I knew it was Deku, but it's funny. The original reason that my parents got me Ocarina of Time was to help me read, actually. And it definitely helped me read a lot more than, again, what they were putting in our school system. And Ocarina is one of those games, definitely, where it is not really hold your hand. If you don't read what you have to do, what kind of strategies you need to take for the boss, you're screwed. And my brother was that kid who just said, oh, I just want to beat stuff up. And then he'd skip all the dialogue. And 5 minutes later, he'd be like, I don't know what to do. And he'd come to me and ask me every single time, what do I do? I'm like, well, I'll be happy to show you. Or sometimes I would just say, well, you should have read the thing. And so there was very much a certain skill gap, for a game for children, essentially, being able to read and comprehend and understand the story was very difficult. And I think that kind of media where, it's motioned towards children, but also to adults, and to fully comprehend it, it kind of goes beyond, the age that you are. And that kind of brings me to another main aspect that I think I've really taken away from Ocarina. I know Ocarina has been analyzed to death over and over and over again. I think the most famous one is something about subtext or something, which I probably watched twice, maybe 3 times, and thought, I have no idea what this guy is saying. But to me, the core message of Ocarina is this: that you cannot betray yourself. And I say that because, when you're a kid in this world, everything's easy, everything's together, everything's fine, everyone's happy. And it's only that in the future things get harder and things get more difficult to deal with. But if you invested in yourself as a child, if you took care of your inventory, if you collected your heart pieces, if you were able to save certain weapons, as adult Link, you would be able to use some of those same weapons, use some of that inventory, your rupees, etc. But who you are as a person, if you took care of yourself, that would allow you in the future to be able to deal with all of this evil nonsense. And so I kind of think of it almost as like, remember in Yu-Gi-Oh when what was his name? There was Yugi, and then there was Yami, who was like the real guy, where he like did the transformation with the pyramid puzzle, Millennium Puzzle. That's kind of what I think about Zelda, in the sense that Link is this kid, but he also has the spirit of this older person within him, and it's only when he comes of age that he can fully materialize that spirit, essentially. And if Link had neglected himself or not persevered in the aspects which he excelled at, he wouldn't be able to take on, the world that Ganondorf created. He needed that courage and that determination to press forward. And it's not just at a certain point in time, but it was through his whole adolescent life. I mean, yes, okay, he slept for 7 years more or less, but up until that point, before he drew the Master Sword, he just had the determination and the perseverance to fully commit himself to that endeavor, and essentially immerse himself in the courage to confront evil and to do what is necessary, not what is easy, but to do what is necessary. No 9 or 8-year-old kid should be climbing Mount Doom or Death Mountain with giant falling rocks crushing him and setting him on fire. And I think it's another thing too that really resonates with me, just on a game level, is that something I'm very big on is scalability. If that's the right term. Where essentially the difference between when you start the game to when you end it is so large and so grand that you kind of just have to say, wow. So, when you start the game, you have 3 hearts, you die, and like very, very easily. By the end of the game, you have, like 20 hearts. You can get all this cool stuff, and you feel like a superhero compared to when you started. And I mean, certain games are good at that. Like, there is, again, like Devil May Cry, but Dante was kind of already a badass when you start the game, and at the end of the game, you're just a badass with more weapons. And so in games, it's not just also the mechanics that you gather, but it's also the story and the process that the individual goes through. And something that I've always found very interesting and compelling about video games as a medium for storytelling is that you are in control. The story will not progress unless you do it. And so you kind of play this dual role where it's not a strict RPG where you made your own custom character because you are Link, tacitly. But you can also name the file after yourself. And because, you don't have, unlike Final Fantasy and other RPGs, when you start the file, it doesn't say Link, it just is blank. So most people just put their own name. And I love that because it adds this level of agency to your actions. And so whenever I would talk about the game to my friends, I would say, I never said Link beat the Fire Temple. Like, that sounded really weird. I said I beat the Fire Temple. Like, I did it. But if this was a movie, you would say, oh, remember when Link beat the Fire Temple? And so it's a really nuanced thing where you are, in turn, animating this character and driving them, and you're having a level of responsibility and agency to this world that if you don't go forward, if you don't persevere, the story will end in a way. And that's why I also hate leaving things unfinished. But anyway, again, I love the idea of music healing the world, and music as a form of power, transportation, transmutation, etc. And something that I find it very akin to in another Nintendo property is Earthbound, actually. Something that I actually appreciated in Mother 1 more than Earthbound were the 8 melodies, where in Earthbound, it's the same thing. You have to find 8 melodies, and really it's just like a series of a few notes, and once you have all of them, it creates this one song. And in Earthbound, it's just like, why do we have to get this? And the answer is because, as Earthbound does. There's a lot of things in Earthbound that are just like, why is this happening? Because. And it just insists upon itself. And depending on who's writing, the game, that can be tremendously funny and tremendously good or tremendously terrible. But Earthbound does it well. But What's more so interesting in Mother 1 is that the 8 notes or 8 melodies, you bring it back to the Princess of Magicant, and it actually creates this song that is the lullaby that this woman used to sing, and that restores her memory. And when it restores her memory, her delusional world of Magicant falls apart, but it gives you the piece of information you need to defeat this ultimate threat, which is Geeg. And it's the power of love encoded through music that is the ultimate thing that saves the day. And that, to me, is thematically, there's nothing greater than that. I don't know why. It always gets me, but I feel that it's the closest thing to magic that humans have, like actual music, the ability to encode a complex personal idea into a form of auditory experience that you can share with other people, and on a flip of a dime change your mood and experience something as deep and as profound as some 70-hour journey is really amazing. And in Zelda, it's not the thing that ultimately finishes the day. I mean, ultimately Link has to go up against Ganon and kind of, defeat him using the light arrow and the Master Sword and everything. But up until that point, Zelda's lullaby has become the line and the strand that permeates the entire experience. And in that, it's this aspect of innocence, because it's a lullaby that changes the world. And it's that aspect of Link's love and adoration for Zelda and her innocence. When they first meet as children, that is the energy and the theme that essentially vanquishes evil. And it's very poignant, I think, that that's the last scene that the game ends on. And in a way, it's very much a tragedy. And I was going to get to this later, but, I don't think people consider Zelda to be dark fantasy, but I do consider Ocarina. It doesn't look and appear like it is, but it definitely is in its content. And it takes itself, it's very serious. Saria ends up... Oh, this is all going to be spoilers, by the way. Saria ends up dying off-screen. We don't know how. You can leave that to your imagination, some awful thing. The Goron, the Kokiri forest is invaded by all these monsters. Your childhood home is destroyed and filled with evil, kind of like, the Shire. It didn't actually happen in Lord of the Rings, but apparently after Return of the King, Tolkien wrote something about the fact that the orcs and Uruk-hai ended up attacking the Shire after Frodo and Sam had done everything. Don't quote me on that, because I didn't read it. I don't have the exact timeline, but apparently that was something that happened. And so you need to restore your home world and your homeland. And I love that Maito has no idea who you are, and a lot of people don't know who you are because they all thought you were Kokori like them. And that's another thing I don't think it's tacitly or explicitly stated in the hero's journey, but the thing that makes the main character weird is actually his strength. And so the fact that he doesn't have a fairy, the fact that he's growing older than all the other people, is actually his strength, because it turns out Link actually is a Hylian. And, the Decretary sends him off and gives the revelation, all this stuff. And it makes you realize there's multiple revelation points, multiple truth-telling points in Zelda, and multiple thresholds. It feels like a very multi-layered story. But the tragedy part is, you have the Kokiri forest has been invaded. Goron City I mean, and like their old problem was that they couldn't get into the cavern to eat their rocks, but now they've all been taken and are going to be sacrificed and eaten by Volvagia, which is definitely a bigger issue. With the Zoras, they're all frozen in ice. I think King Zora, you can defrost him using red fire or something. The Shadow Temple, Kokiri Village is like literally, Kakariko Village is literally on fire, and is cursed by ghosts and demons. And the Spirit Temple, that's just kind of like the Gerudo's homeland, and I think they're just kind of highly militaristic and isolated, so there's not really any problem to solve there. Just kind of like the final, chapter in that story. But you kind of go through all these motions and all these quests, and at the end of it, I think what the in the Greek style, if you had a good ending, it was a comedy, and a bad ending was a tragedy. It was kind of like that. There was that dichotomy. And so when you look at Zelda, when you look at Ocarina rather, it's kind of hard to tell if it's a good ending or a bad ending, because in order to get there is only one ending, by the way, but in order to get there, you have to pay a sacrifice, and that is that Zelda needs to send you back to the past and erase everything that's happened, and she won't remember you. The very essence and reason why you did all this for Zelda, I love the fact that it's called The Legend of Zelda. Even though you play as Link and he's the main character, the game is really about her and really Link's perception of her. And it's so interesting and different to have that nuance. Because usually you just play the game, you play as like whoever, buff guy, Duke Nukem, whatever. But here it's not really about you. I mean, you go through all the struggles, but it's the essence and idea of preserving Zelda, who is the princess of Hyrule, and by extension Hyrule itself. And I don't know, it's such an interesting nuance that everything is done for the maintenance and the maintaining of the world, and by extension Zelda could be seen as part of that world and the main essence of it, that you are struggling not just for yourself, but you're struggling to preserve something that is beyond yourself. You can't make another Zelda. You can't produce another, Triforce of Wisdom. You have to sacrifice yourself to preserve it. And that again ties into the fact that you can't betray your future self. But again, at the end, Zelda has to forget you. So everything you did up until that point, you will save the world, you will preserve the world, you will achieve your ultimate goal, but the one person that means the most to you won't remember what you did. And it's such a bittersweet ending that all the tragedy, all the lives that have been swept away, all of the hardships that have been experienced by the sages and the people, it will all be reversed. And in a way, you should be glad about that, because then now you don't have to have it happen, and you can restore the world. But at the same time, through that hardship, it has turned you into someone just beyond who you were. And in a world where no one knows or acknowledges what you did, you can't help but think, where is the value of that gone? And it's not just about recognition, it's about the fact that people were brought closer together because of these hardships. And it's this amazing thing where you're not only restoring the world, but you're restoring Link's childhood. You're basically giving back his innocence and Zelda's innocence. And you're taking this evil world, and you're not just restoring it, you're just not wiping it away, you're literally undoing everything so that it never happened in the first place. And you can go back to your childhood innocence. You can go back to the days where you didn't have to worry about anything. You can literally go back in time before things were hard, but you have all the knowledge and experience of that and of that world. And it's this magical miracle. It's this thing that's beyond comprehension, and it's what everyone basically desires. But at the same time, the person you care about most, they'll be erased from you, from your memory. And it's funny that I say this, because this is almost exactly like the ending in Near Gestalt, now that I think about it, where the person they care about most is erased from their memory. And it's this weird, tragic kind of ending where you kind of get the hero's reward, you get the gift and the boon, and you save the world from its destruction. But you also lose something in the process, and you basically lose the Zelda at that moment. And in a way, that's kind of the tragedy. It's I know it's very sad to me to think that you essentially lose the entire point of the game, and she does it for you. She sacrifices that energy so that she can give it back to you, back to Link, that she's saying you can now live the life that you deserve to live. And so in a way of self-sacrifice, Zelda turns back time. She does the impossible for your benefit, for your reward. And it's kind of bittersweet in that way. And you kind of see Link and Zelda meet again at the end of the game, and you kind of wonder, without this hardship and this struggle, would they be able to, still live their lives and be able to live a life together, which was created for them by the ultimate sacrifice. And you can give people money and land and power, but you can't ever give back time. You can't ever give back someone's childhood. And that's literally what she does. And to me, it's the most moving, interesting conclusions to a game I've ever seen. And that theme of time and the value of time is a thing that runs through the entire thread of the game. And I don't know if it was after I beat that game as my, I don't know, if it's 8 or 10-year-old brain was terraformed by that idea. But I realized that I don't know, after that point, I never had the ambition that other kids had to, I want to be an adult, I want to be a grown-up. Because I realized it's just going to be harder. Yes, you have less restrictions, but things are going to be more difficult for you. And that innocence, that nature of childhood is something that you just can't ever get back. It's something so rare and so powerful that it's just an unheard of reward that someone sends you back to a time when you didn't have to worry about these awful things. And from that time as a kid, I started really thinking about my future and be like, okay, what kind of, not exactly what kind of person I want to be, but I started to take things more seriously, or I became definitely more self-aware. And I thought, I don't want to be someone who becomes an incompetent hero in the future. And I developed a strong sense of self from that. I also and developed a strong sense of empathy. After that, I went from being kind of an asshole-ish kid to be overly empathetic, too empathetic, frankly. But I just realized that kind of love and that kind of innocence and that kind of notion of fragility and how time washes away all things and all people and all ideas is something that I think everyone needs to hear. That I just thought, I had this moment where I thought everyone needs to hear this story or see this thing, because it's the one thing that I think unites the world. That was what I thought at that time. It's like, this is the one thing that we need to be kind and fair and empathetic to each other, because the world is going to become a dark, cruel, horrible place as we get older, and we need to basically develop a kindness between each other and develop a world where we can all live together in harmony. And that was what Ocarina did to my childhood brain. So, and of course there are the other, tacit things about Zelda. You had, developed your reading ability, puzzle solving ability. It definitely developed my ability or my perception that games are not just games. A game and a video game were very divergent for me at that point, because this was a piece of art to me, and I think it still is a piece of art, because it told me something about the human experience that changed my cognition. And something that changes your cognition is pretty rare and few and far between. And so I think for a lot of people, it kind of revealed to them this precious, innocent, kind of fragile love, for the world, for its inhabitants, knowing that tragedy is prone to strike at any point. You need to be able to prepare yourself and defend those higher ideals, and this kind of feeling of just, fragility. And I've only felt that with a few games. I feel like something that's come close to that is actually Undertale, of all things. That kind of fragile love that exists between people, and how rare it is, and how you want to preserve something so unique. And I think that's why a lot of people consider Zelda to be their favorite game of all time, even to today. And it's not just the plot is really good and it moves at a good pace. I know Donkey basically said the same thing when he picked up Ocarina, because he said he'd never played it, and he said the main thing that surprised him was the pacing. And the pacing and the plot is really solid in Zelda, but it's also the overall theme. It's how it makes you feel, I guess. And it's just that everything is, reward through struggle. Another thing that I incorporated back then is that, in order to get this idea into my brain, I had to learn how to read. I had to learn how to puzzle solve. I had to learn how to do these difficult adult-like things. And even though this was a piece of entertainment, I felt like my brain was expanding as I did effort. And so what even leads now into why I read things like War and Peace and Ulysses and these stupidly big books is that I had the feeling that if I struggle and if I take up the challenge of the path less traveled, then I will be rewarded with knowledge or cognition or something that is beyond my comprehension, that my effort will in turn yield rewards. So if I'm struggling with a piece of media or a book that's just really long, I just had that ingrained in my brain that if you just persevere, you can find a truth that's deeper and more profound and literally life-changing, and that would make it worth it. And I feel like a lot of my indulgence in video games and movies, books, stories is really just chasing that dragon. It's really like we basically peaked with Ocarina, and I feel like everything else has just been running up to it in some way, shape, or form. And it's so interesting, as I just keep describing Ocarina of Time, I keep thinking of things that are very similar to Near Gestalt, in the sense that, you have a story that is, you have puzzle solving, you have combat, whatever. But the main things are that, you have very distinct characters. I think the one thing that Nier has that Zelda doesn't is the banter. Even Nier Automata doesn't really have it. The banter between Vice and Kaine is just... It's peak. It's almost Shakespearean. It's peak. But you have a heavy emphasis on music, on a dark fantasy setting, and again, while Zelda, because it's a Nintendo product, it's kind of like, child rated. It doesn't come across as a dark fantasy like Dark Souls or Nier, but it definitely has the tone and themes of it. And it makes me think too of another game that also left a very distinct impact on me, despite it being so short, and also was incredibly child friendly, but its themes weren't, would be Klonoa. Spoilers for Klonoa, but in the fourth level, or the intro, in the first few levels, Klonoa is this little cute furry Sonic Capcom kind of character, and his grandpa gets killed. And you think, oh no, he's not really dead. There was an explosion, but he's off screen. He's okay. No, he's dead. So, it really brings back this idea that, again, it's not the content that defines a story, but it's the context. So it's the ideas and themes, and how you do them is important. But, if Klonoa was, I don't know, some kind of modern, TV show or something, it was about some kid and his grandpa dying, it would still have that same kind of impact. But because it's abstracted to this childlike universe, it's felt more intensely, because it has this, I guess, kid-friendly demeanor to it, and you have this awful thing happen that is taken very seriously. And there's a lot of things in Klonoa that are just messed up. I don't know if that's a whole genre of a child's media that is suddenly dark. I don't know why. I vibe with that really, really hard. And Zelda is very much like that. Again, people don't really think about it, I feel, but that's kind of what the experience feels like. And again, there are different types of gamers, different types of people, so you may just look at Zelda as its core mechanics, its combat, its gameplay, and not even think about the story and how it conveys itself. I mean, I've at this point, I've given up recommending games to people with the expectation that they have the same outlook or interpretation I have. I mean, I recommended one game to someone once, and they could ask questions were about, oh, what's the best gameplay mechanic, or what's the best way to do this boss, or what's the best way to do this, and I didn't say it, but how about that story? How about that rootin' tootin' story that changed my life? And they didn't mention a thing about it. And I'm like, all right, that's fine. Different strokes, truly. And I think that's pretty much Ocarina in a nutshell, what it means for me. And I do say Ocarina and not Ocarina. This is Ocarina. It's funny, actually. What actually inspired me to say this is someone linked an old episode of Ego Raptor's content on comparing Link to the Past to Ocarina, and I really miss old Ego Raptor. But people were kind of saying as though, look at his takedown of Ocarina. But in that video, he's actually very balanced, and he does do criticisms of Link to the Past. And what I love about it is that his main criticism of Ocarina is that the gameplay is slow. It's like he needs that old school NES, the game starts and you're in the gameplay. He's gameplay first. And I just laughed because at least he has the good decency to criticize both games on certain aspects, I forget what he said about Link to the Past, but he said something along the lines about, the open world, it opens up to you, but then it makes you go in a sequential order. So what the hell's the point anyway? Stuff like that. But yeah, to me, Ocarina is just an amazing, amazing story, an amazing cast of characters, and the fact that it gives you agency, you feel like you actually went through that whole experience. It's something very unique to the medium of video games, and I can't, again, recommend Ocarina enough. I feel like maybe a lot of people don't play it because it has that title of best game ever, so people just like, whatever, or they feel, oh, it's too whole, I can't play it on a Tuesday afternoon. No, but I feel like people just need to jump into it. At the same time, though, I really don't like the 3DS version. I just don't like how it looks. I don't like how it controls. One of the cool things about the menu in like Ocarina and on the N64 is that it would like come in as this box thing. I don't know if that was like a preview to like the GameCube or something, but I always thought it was really cool. It's one of the more interesting menus that I've seen. Like most menus, they just pop up, but in Zelda, it's kind of like this thing where it like folds in onto you, like you're inside a box or something. I don't know. It was kind of cool. But yeah, I just don't like how 3DS looks. I'm not saying if you played it, that's like the wrong way to play it. I'm just saying if you can just get like a ROM or an emulator or whatever, or get an N64 and play the original, that is mega based if you do that. Like actual king material. Like I'll kneel. I kneel to anyone who buys a retro console in modern day and plays the games originally as they were in the original aspect. You don't need a CRT though, plasma, whatever, whatever TV screen is fine. But if you use the original controller, original console, I'm like, that's mad respect. Jesus. I guess something else that I just thought of is, Ocarina, when you look at its fan art, its fan projects, it's really hard to measure a fandom or a fan base by, most fandoms are absolute cancer. And I mean that in a very, literal aspect, where it's this thing that grows and grows and grows more than it needs to. Healthy cells that otherwise keep growing more to the point where they are unnecessary, and it's this over exuberance that leads to its terminal death, and people kind of realize, oh, I might have gone a bit far in some places. But in Zelda, it's always been very moderate to me. It's never been overly exuberant, but the artwork has always been really good. It's always been really tight, and it's never been something that's been, the sign of controversy. I hear crazy things about, obviously Final Fantasy and Undertale and God help us other things that come to mind. But I feel like the fruits of the Zelda fandom kind of speak for themselves in a certain way. I might talk about other Zelda games in the future, but for me, Ocarina is kind of my basis for what is a really, really solid game. Majora's Mask is kind of like an alt version to it. I enjoy it, but it was just kind of a little bit too weird in some aspects. It didn't really have that core experience. It was a bit more emotional in some ways, just through all the different side stories like Anju and Cafe, Skull Kid's actual story. Briefly, Wind Waker, everyone despised Wind Waker just because of what they showed at Space World 2000 or 2001 with HD realistic Ganondorf fighting Link with his sword, and we got Toon Link. But it turned out that Wind Waker is actually my second favorite Zelda game, just from the story, the way it does things. It has that childlike nature to it, but it also has those dark themes as well. It's really good. Twilight Princess is the game that looked like the game we all wanted, but it's kind of mid. And then Skyward Sword, we don't even talk about Skyward Sword. It's trash. No one likes it. And then we have New Zelda, which is, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, which, while they're good, and they are really good games, mechanically, they definitely don't have the same exuberance and vibrance and soul and characters and story that old Zelda did. To me, Ocarina is peak Zelda. Link to the Past, also a pretty good rendition, but of course it's in the 2D space, and I feel like 2D Zelda and 3D Zelda are just kind of in slightly different tracks. It's funny, I really didn't enjoy Breath of the Wild. I think Tears of the Kingdom really improved on adding caves, honestly, because they just added more stuff in the world rather than traversing a lot of it, which was very onerous and just time wasty, Despite that, it's been copied by Genshin Impact, which is the highest grossing video game of all time, perhaps, so who am I to judge? And the one thing that I do have to say about Ocarina is that the official timeline thing, where apparently in the official timeline, I think it's some fan theory that Nintendo just threw their hands up and said, fine, sure, whatever, and they put it in Hyrule Historia, where at the end of Ocarina, it's kind of the main branch point where you have 3 different timelines. You have the timeline in which Link goes back to the past, and they have the other timeline where you left behind, where Ganondorf is defeated, and apparently it just didn't disappear, just like, oh, that timeline continued, and you're like, okay. And then you have another timeline where it's totally made up, where apparently Link dies in that final fight, and that's another timeline that leads to a series of other games, essentially. And I think it's dumb. I have no issue with Nintendo just making a new Legend of Zelda, just saying, yep, this is just completely new, we're just starting it from here. There's a few games which are obviously sequels, like Majora to Ocarina, and Spirit Tracks to Wind Waker, but again, I don't need everything to fit in a perfect bow-tied timeline. I am totally fine with things not conjoining, connecting, because the tone of each game, appropriately, should be different. If you want to go in a completely different direction, make Toon Link and make a totally different aesthetic for Twilight Princess, it's like, go ahead and do that. Be my guest. I don't need everything to link together. Not sure what else to say. Bomb Chews were weird. You found them in the Gerudo Desert, and they were in the middle of nowhere, and they had no discernible use except to get a certain piece of heart, and they went up walls, and it was like, okay, cool, this is neat, but not necessary, essentially. I thought it was really cool. The ice arrow was an optional weapon that you got for doing a side quest in the Gerudo Fortress and doing the archery range, the little dungeon. I find that really, really exciting, where you get a mainline item that is from a long side quest. It felt really rewarding to get that. I thought the Iron Gauntlets were cool, and the Golden Gauntlets. Sorry, the Iron Gauntlets are the enemies. I'm talking about the Golden Gauntlets that help you lift stuff. I always on the schoolyard, I use that as my trump card for, when we did death battle between who would win, Link or Dante or Master Chief or whatever. Well, it's well, Link's just like a fairy boy. He can't do shit. And it's well, actually, get my glasses out. He has the gold gauntlets, which allows him the super strength to lift an entire stone pillar. Okay, and by the way, he also has Din's Fire, so at any time he can activate a thermonuclear blast from his person. Alright. Oh, and by the way, he also has Fiora's Wind, so he can teleport instantaneously whenever he wants. Oh, and by the way, he also has Nairu's Love, which totally shields him from all damage, and he's impervious. Alright, okay. It was a stupid, it was always stupid to say, who would win in these different contexts, but I always thought Link always had it in the bag, even though he had basic stuff. I'm actually kind of surprised they didn't use Din's Fire for his final smash. I guess it makes sense. Yeah, honestly, Din's Fire was totally useless in the game. I think it was supposed to be the replacement for Link to the Past, the Quake thing, or the thing that kills everything on the screen. In a 2D space, it's very easy to do, but in a 3D space, it's a lot harder. Din's Fire looked fire. It looked really cool. It didn't really do much. It was kind of a crappy thing that just took a lot of magic. Yeah, I think those are kind of the small lingering thoughts I have. I think it's also really cool that you were able to go back in time to a kid and do a little, back and forth stuff. I love that a game allows you to go back in time and get literally all the stuff you wanted to, something that Nier Gestalt could learn. They put it in a replicant where I think you can go, back in time, I think, to before. Actually, no, I think they kept that in. Like, if you don't get all the quests before the midpoint, then you're just kind of screwed. But yeah, everything from the Temple of Time was a religious holy experience, more than going to church for me. More than any church, the Temple of Time is my holy place. That made me realize that I love Gregorian chants. If a game has Gregorian chants, Final Fantasy VII, Halo, I am there. I am running to the game store to buy that game if you have Gregorian chants. But yeah, I think this video's gone on long enough. There's probably a few other lingering thoughts I have about Ocarina, but you kind of get the gist. I love the game, absolute classic, and I hope everyone gets to experience it at some point. And I love these 64-bit graphics because, again, it was something where I love 64-bit graphics the most because you can tell what things are. They're not total blocks and bits, but they're not fully rendered. And what that occurs is interpolation. So when you see artwork of Ocarina and you think, oh, this looks really epic, and you look at the gameplay and you're like, oh, that doesn't look really good, it's because our minds are actually over-interpreting the thing happening in front of us, and that aspect of interpolation and mental interpretation that naturally occurs with that style of graphics, especially when the audio is much better than the graphics, creates a much more distinct experience, and something that I think from game design, I just want to see more of that. I think it's so cool. Anyway, my favorite game of all time, from my heart to you guys. That's my little analysis and interpretation. And I'll see you later. Bye.